Thomas Mitchell froze mid-step, his weathered hand gripping the rifle as his eyes locked onto the impossible sight beneath the towering pine. A 7-year-old girl in a torn pink jacket clutched a newborn baby against her chest, both trembling in the Montana wilderness, where the temperature had dropped to 15 below zero. Her cracked lips whispered through chattering teeth, "Please don't let him find us." It wasn't a lost camping family. Luna's massive frame went rigid beside him, her amber eyes reflecting something Thomas had never seen in 8 years together: maternal recognition. The wolf dog's ears flattened as a low whimper escaped her throat, and Thomas felt his own chest constrict with a pain he'd buried 15 years ago. His coffee-stained thermos slipped from his trembling fingers, shattering the forest silence as hot liquid steamed against frozen earth. The little girl's eyes, Katie's eyes, stared up at him with the same desperate trust his daughter had shown the night she died. His breath caught, creating crystals in the bitter air as memories crashed through his carefully constructed walls. "Dear God," he whispered, already moving toward them. "How long have you been out here?" Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Thomas Mitchell had learned to live with ghosts, but he'd never expected them to walk out of a Montana blizzard carrying newborn babies. At 68, the former Special Forces medic moved with the careful precision of a man whose body remembered every battlefield, every mission, every mistake. His cabin sat on 43 acres of wilderness, purchased with his wife Margaret's life insurance money after the accident that destroyed everything he'd ever loved. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd built his sanctuary on the exact stretch of mountain road where he'd killed his family 15 years ago. Every morning, he drove past the memorial cross he'd planted for Margaret and 7-year-old Katie, and every morning he wondered why God had let him live when they hadn't. Some folks called it survivor's guilt. Thomas called it justice delayed. Luna padded beside him as he carried the children toward the cabin, her massive frame casting shadows across the snow. She wasn't just any wolf-dog hybrid, she was Katie's dog, the only survivor of that Christmas Eve crash who'd somehow crawled from the wreckage and found him 3 days later. Most people didn't know that detail. Hell, most people didn't know Luna existed at all. The cabin's interior reflected 15 years of careful solitude. Military precise organization, minimal furniture, and photographs turned face down on every surface. His Purple Heart sat in a drawer beneath unpaid medical bills and a stack of rejection letters from the VA. At $1,847 monthly pension, Thomas lived on beans, instant coffee, and the occasional deer Luna helped him track. But tonight, as he settled the half-frozen children near his wood-burning stove, something shifted in the cabin's carefully maintained emptiness. Emma's eyes, those devastating blue eyes so much like Katie's, followed his every movement with desperate trust. The baby, wrapped in Thomas's last clean flannel shirt, breathed in shallow puffs that reminded him of Katie's final moments in the hospital. Luna positioned herself between the children and the door, her intelligent eyes scanning the windows with an alertness Thomas recognized from combat zones. Her scarred left shoulder, injured in the same crash that claimed his family, bore fresh wounds from carrying Emma through the snow. The animal's devotion had transcended species boundaries long ago, but tonight, watching her gentle nose nudge the baby's blanket, Thomas witnessed something unprecedented. She was mothering them. As Emma finally succumbed to exhaustion, her small hand clutched Luna's thick fur, while her other arm remained protectively curved around her brother. Thomas pulled up the single chair in his cabin and began his first vigil for someone else's children, knowing that whoever had hurt this family was still out there in the darkness, waiting. The satellite phone's static crackled through the cabin at 4:17 a.m. when Sheriff Ray Williams finally returned Thomas's emergency call. Emma jerked awake at the sound, her thin body instinctively curling around baby Jake as Luna's ears swiveled toward potential threats. The old rotary mechanism felt foreign in Thomas's calloused hands. He'd avoided human contact for so long that even emergency calls required conscious effort. "Tommy? Jesus Christ, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you for 3 days." Ray's voice carried the weight of 40 years in law enforcement and 20 years of friendship that had survived combat zones, failed marriages, and Thomas's self-imposed exile. "We got reports of a missing family, mother found beaten unconscious near Highway 2. 2 kids unaccounted for." Thomas watched Emma's eyes widen with recognition and terror. Her small fingers tightened on Luna's fur as she whispered, "That's Mama." "Is she alive?" "She's stable," Thomas relayed, covering the phone's mouthpiece. "Fighting hard to get back to you." The relief that flooded Emma's face reminded him so sharply of Katie's expressions that he had to steady himself against the wall. Ray continued, "The mother keeps asking about Emma and Jake. Says they're in danger from some charity organization. Ring any bells?" The name Marcus Volkov emerged through the static like a curse word. Child services contractor, recent relocation from Denver after complaints. Clean record on paper, but Ray's instincts suggested otherwise. While Thomas gathered intelligence, Luna demonstrated behavior that defied every animal training manual he'd ever read. The wolf dog had arranged Emma's blankets with her teeth, nudged the baby's bottle within reach, and positioned herself as a living barrier between the children and every possible entry point. Her actions weren't random. They followed military defensive protocols Thomas had never taught her. Emma whispered fragments of their escape, running through snow in darkness, Mama falling down, staying warm by digging holes, feeding Jake with water from melted snow. Her matter-of-fact delivery of survival techniques no child should know sent ice through Thomas's veins. This wasn't neglect. This was preparation for war. The tracking device discovery came accidentally. Luna's growl drew Thomas's attention to Emma's stuffed rabbit, a threadbare toy she clutched like a lifeline. The wolf dog's nose repeatedly nudged the toy's belly until Emma tearfully allowed Thomas to examine it. Inside, nestled between cotton stuffing, sat a GPS tracker no bigger than a dime. "They always know where we are," Emma said, her voice carrying resignation that belonged to prisoners, not children. "Marcus gives presents with special helpers inside." Mama tried to throw them away, but he got angry. Thomas's military training kicked into overdrive. Someone with resources and technical knowledge had orchestrated this family's terror with surgical precision. The tracker meant they'd been monitored throughout their escape, their refuge compromised from the moment Emma crossed his threshold. Ray's voice returned through the static. "Tommy, we're dealing with something bigger than domestic violence here. Denver PD found evidence of a trafficking operation, kids disappearing through fake charity adoptions, parents threatened into silence." As if summoned by their conversation, Luna's hackles rose. She moved to the window, her massive head tilted in concentration. Thomas followed her gaze into the pre-dawn darkness and spotted them. 2 sets of headlights moving slowly along the forest road, no sound of engines carrying through the crisp air. "Ray, they're here," Thomas said quietly, watching Emma's face drain of color. "I need backup and I need it fast." The line went dead. Emma crawled to Thomas's side, baby Jake cradled against her chest. "He promised he'd never let us go," she whispered. "Marcus says we're his special family now." Luna's low growl filled the cabin as the headlights stopped just beyond the tree line. Thomas extinguished the kerosene lamp with practiced military precision, plunging the cabin into darkness save for the wood stove's orange glow. His hands moved automatically to the rifle mounted above the fireplace, a Winchester Model 70 that hadn't been fired in anger since Afghanistan, but still held a full magazine because old habits die hard and some battles never truly end. Emma pressed herself against the wall, Jake's tiny form barely visible in her protective embrace. "He found us," she whispered, her voice carrying the hollow resignation of someone far older than 7. "Marcus always finds us." The headlights had vanished, but Thomas's trained eye caught the subtle shift in shadows that marked human movement through the tree line. Luna's behavior confirmed his worst fears. The wolf dog had positioned herself in a defensive crouch that spoke to threats she recognized on an instinctual level. Her damaged shoulder trembled with tension, and the low rumble emanating from her chest carried frequencies that raised the hair on Thomas's arms. "Emma, honey, I need you to listen carefully." Thomas knelt beside her, his voice carrying the calm authority that had guided soldiers through combat. "There's a crawl space behind the water heater. Take Jake and get in there. Don't come out until Luna comes to get you, understand?" The child's nod was almost imperceptible, but her movements were swift and silent as she gathered the baby and disappeared into the cabin's hidden recesses. Thomas had built that space during his darkest period, when paranoia and guilt had convinced him that his past might literally come knocking. He'd never imagined it would shelter someone else's children. Luna remained motionless at the window, her intelligence apparent in the calculated way she tracked multiple movement patterns outside. Thomas had always suspected she possessed cognitive abilities beyond typical canines, but tonight her tactical awareness bordered on supernatural. She understood the danger these children represented, not just to themselves, but to the fragile peace Thomas had constructed from the wreckage of his former life. The first probe came as a test. A shadow passed deliberately across the main window, close enough that condensation from human breath fogged the glass. Luna's growl deepened, but she held position. Thomas felt his heart rate settle into combat rhythm, muscle memory overriding 15 years of civilian life. His finger found the rifle's safety without conscious thought. Then came the voice, cultured and confident, carrying through the thin cabin walls with practiced authority. "Mr. Mitchell, my name is Marcus Volkov. I represent Child Protective Services, and I need to speak with you about the children you're harboring." Thomas's blood turned to ice water. Child Protective Services, the same organization that had investigated him after Katie's death, that had questioned his fitness as a parent while his daughter lay dying in intensive care. The same system that had failed to prosecute him for vehicular manslaughter because dead children can't testify about their father's drinking. "I know you're in there, Mr. Mitchell. I also know about your history with alcohol-related incidents involving minors." Marcus's words carried the surgical precision of someone who understood exactly which scars to reopen. "These children have been reported missing from their legal guardian. I have documentation." Luna's reaction was immediate and terrifying. The wolf dog's hackles rose to full height as she positioned herself directly in front of the crawl space entrance. Her behavior suggested she recognized more than just Thomas's distress. She was responding to something primal, something that transcended human understanding of threat assessment. Thomas moved to the radio equipment he'd maintained since his service days, hands shaking as he attempted to raise Sheriff Williams on the emergency frequency. Static answered his desperate calls, atmospheric interference turning his lifeline into meaningless noise. The isolation that had once been his salvation had become a tactical disadvantage. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to need you to open the door and surrender the children peacefully." Marcus's voice grew closer, suggesting movement around the cabin's perimeter. "Their mother is in protective custody, and they require immediate medical attention that you're not qualified to provide." The lie cut deep because it contained enough truth to wound. Thomas wasn't qualified to care for traumatized children. He'd proven that catastrophically with his own daughter. But Emma's whispered terror when Marcus's name was mentioned suggested that surrender meant something far worse than inadequate care. Luna suddenly stiffened, her attention shifting to the cabin's rear window. Her growl became urgent, almost conversational, as if she were trying to communicate specific tactical information. Thomas followed her gaze and spotted the second shadow. Marcus hadn't come alone. "I have legal authority here, Mr. Mitchell. These children are wards of the state, and you're interfering with official custody procedures." The voice was closer now, perhaps 20 feet from the front door. "I'd hate for this situation to escalate unnecessarily." Thomas checked the rifle's chamber, knowing that his next decision would either save these children or add their names to the list of lives he'd failed to protect. Luna's amber eyes met his in the dim light, and for a moment he could swear he saw Katie looking back at him through the wolf dog's intelligent gaze. Outside, footsteps crunched deliberately through the snow, circling the cabin with the methodical patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to run. Thomas counted at least 3 distinct movement patterns, possibly more, professional operation, not desperate parents searching for missing children. Emma's muffled sob drifted from the crawlspace as baby Jake began to cry. The sound that had drawn Thomas through the forest now threatened to betray their location to whatever darkness waited beyond his walls. Luna's massive head turned toward the hidden children, her expression carrying an almost human understanding of the impossible choice they all faced. The first gentle knock on the door came at exactly 4:47 a.m., polite and persistent, carrying the false courtesy of authority figures who never expected to be refused. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of desperate improvisation and growing dread that settled over Thomas's cabin like smoke from a house fire that refused to die. Emma had finally spoken her family's story in fragments, each revelation more disturbing than the last, while baby Jake fought a losing battle against pneumonia that Thomas's field medic training could only delay, not cure. Sarah Hartwell had been a registered nurse in Billings until Marcus Volkov's Children's Future Foundation entered her life through the hospital's financial assistance program. Single mothers drowning in medical debt made perfect targets for his particular brand of salvation. The offer seemed legitimate: housing assistance, job placement, educational support for Emma, and most importantly, comprehensive medical coverage for Jake's ongoing respiratory issues stemming from premature birth. What Sarah hadn't understood was that Marcus collected families the way some men collected stamps, carefully cataloging their weaknesses, mapping their dependencies, and gradually transforming assistance into ownership. The tracking devices weren't just for security, they were for inventory management. Children who disappeared into Marcus's network rarely resurfaced in recognizable form. Thomas learned these details through Emma's matter-of-fact recitations, delivered in the detached tone of someone repeating instructions she'd been forced to memorize. "Marcus says children need structure and purpose. He has special schools where kids learn important jobs. Mama found pictures on his computer of kids working in big houses far away." The industrial-scale horror of it hit Thomas like shrapnel. This wasn't random predation. It was systematic harvesting, using America's broken social safety net as a recruitment tool. Desperate families seeking help instead found themselves trapped in contracts that granted Marcus increasing control over their children's lives, their movements, their futures. Luna seemed to understand the gravity of their situation through some instinct that transcended species boundaries. The wolf dog had established a routine of perimeter checks every 2 hours, her massive frame moving through the snow with the silent precision of her wild ancestors. More remarkably, she'd begun what Thomas could only describe as tactical communication. positioning herself at specific locations to indicate direction of threats, using different vocalizations to signal various types of danger. The children's health crisis intensified on the second day. Jake's labored breathing and rising fever demanded medical intervention that Thomas's remote location couldn't provide, while Emma exhibited signs of severe malnutrition and psychological trauma that made his chest tighten with familiar helplessness. He'd failed to save his own daughter from death. Now, he faced the possibility of losing 2 more children to circumstances beyond his control. Thomas's first attempt to reach the highway for medical evacuation ended when Luna refused to let him load the children into his truck. The wolf dog physically blocked their path, her behavior so agitated that Thomas realized she was trying to communicate imminent danger. Within minutes, his instincts proved correct. Fresh tire tracks in the snow indicated surveillance vehicles had been positioned along every possible exit route. The psychological warfare began in earnest on the 3rd day. Marcus's voice drifted through the forest on a portable speaker system, delivering monologues designed to erode Thomas's resolve through targeted emotional manipulation. Mr. Mitchell, your military record shows 3 confirmed kills in Afghanistan and 1 civilian casualty in Montana. Are you really the person these children should trust with their safety? Emma's reaction to Marcus's voice was immediate and devastating. The child curled into a fetal position, hands clamped over her ears, while her body shook with trauma responses that Luna recognized before Thomas did. The wolf dog immediately moved to provide deep pressure therapy, her massive frame settling across Emma's legs while her warm breath regulated the child's panicked breathing. Thomas found himself reliving his own interrogation 15 years earlier, when Child Protective Services had questioned his fitness as a father, while Katie lay dying in pediatric intensive care. The investigators had been thorough and merciless, documenting every empty beer bottle in his trash, every missed parent-teacher conference, every moment of imperfect parenting that had culminated in Christmas Eve's catastrophic ending. You failed your own daughter, Mr. Mitchell. Don't fail these children, too. Marcus's words carried across the snow with surgical precision, each syllable designed to reopen wounds that had never properly healed. I'm offering them opportunities you could never provide: education, medical care, stable homes with families who actually want them. The lie was so polished that Thomas almost believed it himself. Almost. Until Luna's reaction reminded him that animals don't lie, don't rationalize, don't construct elaborate justifications for evil. The wolf dog's assessment was simple and absolute. These people meant harm to her adopted pack, and she would die before allowing it. Emma's breakthrough came during the 3rd night's siege, when exhaustion and fever made her defenses crumble enough for truth to emerge. Marcus showed us videos of the other kids, she whispered, while Thomas changed Jake's diaper with hands that had once performed emergency surgery in combat zones. They looked happy in the pictures, but their eyes were wrong, like dolls' eyes. The child's observation chilled Thomas more than Marcus's psychological warfare. Emma had learned to read deception in adults' faces, to recognize the difference between genuine care and performed affection. Her survival had depended on distinguishing between safety and its clever imitations. Luna's vigil had become something beyond animal instinct. The wolf dog hadn't slept more than 15-minute intervals in 3 days, her attention split between monitoring external threats and providing comfort to children who'd learned to fear the very adults meant to protect them. Her scarred shoulder had reopened during one particularly intense defensive posture, yet she refused to leave her post for treatment. Thomas found himself studying Luna with new appreciation for the intelligence that had sustained their 8-year partnership. She understood concepts like time, threat assessment, and tactical patience that suggested cognitive abilities far beyond typical canines. More importantly, she'd formed emotional attachments to Emma and Jake that mirrored maternal bonds, complete with willingness to sacrifice herself for their protection. The financial reality of their situation became clear when Thomas counted his remaining cash reserves, $347, and a maxed-out credit card that barely covered Jake's formula and Emma's basic nutrition needs. His veteran's disability payments wouldn't arrive for another 2 weeks, and the nearest bank sat 40 miles away through roads that Marcus's people now controlled. Emma's artwork provided the most devastating insight into their circumstances. Using crayons Thomas had forgotten he owned, she drew pictures that documented her family's journey from normal life to nightmare survival. The progression was unmistakable. Early drawings showed typical family scenes, later ones featured shadowy figures watching through windows, and the most recent depicted children in cages with numbers written on their foreheads. "This one's me," Emma pointed to a small figure in the corner of her latest drawing. "Number 47. Marcus says the numbers help keep track of which kids go to which new families." Thomas stared at the drawing until his vision blurred. The methodical numbering system suggested an operation with scale and organization that dwarfed his worst assumptions. These weren't crimes of opportunity. They were assembly line processing of human beings too young to resist, too innocent to understand, too powerless to escape. Luna's intelligence manifested again when she began displaying photographs that Thomas kept hidden in his bedroom dresser, images of Katie at various ages that he'd been unable to look at for 15 years. The wolf dog somehow understood that Emma needed to see proof that she wasn't the first child Thomas had cared for, that his protective instincts came from experience with loving someone small and vulnerable. The photographs triggered Emma's first genuine smile since arriving at the cabin. "She looks like me," she observed, studying Katie's school portrait with the intensity of someone searching for family resemblances. "Was she your little girl?" Thomas nodded, unable to trust his voice. Luna positioned herself between them, her massive head resting on Emma's lap, while her intelligent eyes held Thomas's gaze with something approaching understanding. The moment felt sacred. 3 survivors of different tragedies recognizing their shared need for redemption. Jake's condition deteriorated throughout the 3rd night, his tiny chest working overtime against fluid accumulation that Thomas's improvised respiratory therapy couldn't clear. The baby's labored breathing reminded him of Katie's final hours, when machines had breathed for her while he'd begged God for miracles that never came. Marcus's voice returned with the dawn, carrying new urgency that suggested his patience was reaching its limit. "Mr. Mitchell, I have buyers arriving this afternoon. These children have already been promised to families who've paid substantial placement fees. Don't force me to collect them by less pleasant means." The casual mention of buyers confirmed Thomas's worst fears about Emma's drawings and Jake's assigned number. This wasn't about child welfare, it was about inventory management for an international trafficking network that used legitimate-seeming charities as front operations. Luna's response to Marcus's ultimatum was unlike anything Thomas had witnessed in their 8 years together. The wolf dog systematically moved through the cabin, checking every possible entry point before settling into a defensive position that blocked access to both children while maintaining visual contact with all potential threat vectors. Her tactical thinking was flawless. Emma emerged from the crawl space long enough to press something into Thomas's hand, a small plastic device that looked like a hearing aid battery. "Sarah taught me to hide these," she whispered. "She said if something happened to her, I should find a phone and press the red button." Thomas examined the device with growing amazement. It was an emergency beacon, military-grade equipment that his own unit had used for extraction requests in hostile territory. Sarah Hartwell had been far more prepared for this confrontation than anyone realized. The beacon's activation sent an encrypted signal to federal authorities who'd been tracking Marcus's operation for months. Within minutes, Thomas's radio crackled with incoming messages from agencies he'd never expected to hear from again. But Marcus's deadline was approaching, and backup was still hours away through mountain roads that offered no quick passage. Thomas realized he was facing the same impossible choice that had haunted him for 15 years: risk everything to save children who depended on him, knowing that failure meant losing them forever. Luna seemed to sense his internal struggle. The wolf dog approached him with deliberate steps, placed her massive paws on his shoulders, and held his gaze with eyes that reflected not just animal intelligence but something approaching human comprehension. In that moment, Thomas understood that some battles can't be won alone, but they can be fought together. The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder as Marcus's deadline expired and his patience finally snapped into something far more dangerous than bureaucratic authority. The assault began at 6:43 a.m. with the methodical precision of a military operation, confirming Thomas's worst suspicions about Marcus's background and resources. 3 black SUVs emerged from the tree line in tactical formation, their occupants moving with the coordinated efficiency of professionals who'd done this before. Luna's hackles rose to full alert as she tracked multiple threats approaching from different vectors. Marcus Volkov stepped from the lead vehicle wearing a perfectly pressed suit beneath his winter coat, his appearance suggesting federal authority rather than the desperate criminal Thomas had expected. At 42, Marcus carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, his pale blue eyes scanning the cabin's defensive positions with appreciation for Thomas's military preparations. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm going to make this very simple for you," Marcus called across the snow, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who'd spent years manipulating bureaucratic systems. "You have 2 children who belong to my organization. Their mother signed legal documents transferring custody before her unfortunate accident. You're interfering with a lawful child welfare operation." Thomas remained motionless behind his barricaded door, but Luna's behavior suggested she recognized something specific about Marcus's scent. Not just general threat, but personal familiarity. The wolf dog's growl carried frequencies that indicated recognition rather than simple territorial warning. "You see, Thomas, may I call you Thomas? I know about your history with child endangerment. Christmas Eve 2008. Margaret and Katie Mitchell, ages 34 and 7 respectively." Marcus's words were delivered with surgical precision, each fact designed to maximize psychological damage. Blood alcohol content 0.12, double the legal limit. Katie survived the initial impact but died from complications during surgery you couldn't afford to properly fund. The accusations hit Thomas like physical blows, each one true enough to wound but twisted enough to serve Marcus's narrative. Luna pressed against his legs, her massive frame providing stability as memories threatened to drag him back into the darkness he'd spent 15 years trying to escape. "The interesting part, Thomas, is that I was the social worker assigned to investigate your fitness as a parent during Katie's hospitalization." Marcus moved closer, his smile carrying the cold satisfaction of long-delayed revenge. "I recommended immediate removal of custody, but Katie died before my report could be filed. You were never held accountable for killing your daughter." The revelation struck Thomas like lightning. Marcus wasn't just some opportunistic predator, he was the young social worker who'd interviewed him in Katie's hospital room, who'd documented every failure of Thomas's parenting, who'd promised that justice would be served even if the legal system failed to act. Emma's muffled sob from the crawl space indicated she was listening to every word, learning that her protector carried the same guilt that had driven her own family to desperate flight. Thomas felt the familiar weight of unworthiness settling over him like a burial shroud. The voice that whispered he had no right to save children when he'd failed to save his own. Luna's reaction was immediate and fierce. The wolf dog positioned herself directly in front of the crawl space entrance, her amber eyes locked on Thomas with an intensity that bordered on telepathic communication. Her message was unmistakable. Past failures didn't negate present opportunities for redemption. Marcus continued his psychological assault with the patience of someone who understood that broken men were easier to control than angry ones. "I've built something beautiful, Thomas. A network that saves children from parents like you, addicts, criminals, failures who hurt the ones they claim to love. These children will have opportunities, education, purpose. What can you offer them? A cabin with no electricity? Expired canned goods? The companionship of a dangerous animal?" The attack on Luna triggered something primal in Thomas's protective instincts. The wolf dog had been his salvation, his conscience, his only connection to life beyond mere survival. She'd pulled him back from suicide attempts, forced him to maintain basic health, and provided the only unconditional love he'd experienced since Margaret's death. "You want to know what I can offer them?" Thomas called back, his voice carrying newfound strength. "I can offer them someone who understands what it means to fail, what it costs to lose everything, and why that makes saving them worth dying for." Marcus's laugh carried genuine amusement. "Admirable sentiment, but the children are already legally mine. Their mother signed irrevocable custody agreements as part of her assistance package. These documents have been notarized and filed with appropriate agencies." The legal maneuvering revealed the true sophistication of Marcus's operation. He didn't simply steal children. He acquired them through contracts that desperate parents signed without understanding their implications. The assistance programs provided just enough help to create dependency, then gradually increased obligations until parents found themselves bound by agreements that transferred increasing control over their children's lives. Emma's voice drifted from the crawl space, barely audible, but carrying steel that reminded Thomas of Katie's stubbornness. "Mama never signed anything. She told me Marcus makes fake papers with machines that copy signatures." The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Document forgery elevated Marcus's crimes from exploitation to federal fraud, but it also suggested resources and connections that made him far more dangerous than a simple predator. Luna's intelligence manifested in ways that defied explanation as she began displaying tactical awareness that seemed almost supernatural. The wolf dog had somehow understood the conversation enough to retrieve specific items. First, Thomas's military medals from their storage box, then photographs of Katie, finally a legal document Thomas had forgotten he possessed. The custody evaluation from 15 years ago, signed by Marcus Volkov as investigating social worker, contained handwritten notes in the margins that revealed his personal investment in Thomas's case. Subject shows no remorse for vehicular homicide. Recommend permanent custody revocation and criminal prosecution. The document was dated 3 days after Katie's death when Thomas had been catatonic with grief. "You destroyed my career, Thomas." Marcus's voice carried personal venom that explained his 15-year pursuit. "My recommendation for prosecution was overruled by supervisors who thought you'd suffered enough. I was reassigned to desk duty, then terminated for excessive zeal in child protection cases. You cost me everything." The professional vendetta added layers of complexity to Marcus's criminal empire. His trafficking operation wasn't just about profit. It was about proving his theories regarding parental fitness, demonstrating that children were better off removed from families he deemed inadequate. Thomas realized he was facing someone who'd spent 15 years building both criminal enterprises and personal justifications for revenge. Marcus had transformed his bitterness about failed justice into a crusade that allowed him to rationalize stealing children as rescue operations. The psychological profile was terrifyingly familiar. Thomas had met men like Marcus in combat zones, individuals who'd suffered genuine injustices that gradually warped their moral compasses until they became the very evil they'd originally fought against. The tragedy wasn't just Marcus's crimes, but the recognizable human pain that had birthed them. Emma's fever broke during the fourth night, her small body finally responding to Thomas's improvised care and Luna's constant warmth. The child's recovery coincided with increasing activity around the cabin's perimeter, suggesting that Marcus's patience with negotiations was approaching its end. "Last chance, Thomas." Marcus's voice carried finality that made Luna's growl deepen into frequencies that seemed to vibrate through the cabin's walls. "My associates have less patience than I do for sentimental old soldiers and their pets." The threat was unmistakable. Marcus had exhausted legal and psychological approaches, leaving only violence as his remaining option for acquiring the children. Thomas checked his rifle's ammunition count and realized that his military training was about to face its most important test, not against foreign enemies, but against a domestic evil that had learned to wear the mask of authority. Luna positioned herself for what Thomas recognized as a final defensive stand. The wolf dog's scarred body carried 15 years of shared grief and survival, and her amber eyes reflected absolute commitment to protecting the children who'd somehow become her pack. Outside, engines revved with increasing aggression as Marcus's deadline expired and his true nature finally emerged from behind its carefully constructed facade of child welfare concern. The final assault came with dawn's first light, swift and brutal, like everything Marcus touched. The front door exploded inward under the force of a tactical ram, splinters of Thomas's carefully crafted barrier scattering across the cabin floor like broken promises. Luna's snarl erupted into something primal as 3 men in tactical gear stormed through the breach, their movements coordinated with military precision that Thomas recognized from his own service days. "Down! Get down!" The commands came in practiced unison as Thomas raised his rifle, knowing even as his finger found the trigger that he was outnumbered and outgunned. Luna launched herself at the nearest intruder with the fury of a mother protecting her cubs, her massive frame colliding with Kevlar-protected torso in an explosion of violence that sent both bodies crashing into Thomas's sparse furniture. The wolf dog's attack created the opening Thomas needed. His first shot went wide, deliberately, the concussion in the small cabin space stunning the attackers long enough for him to dive toward the crawlspace entrance. Emma's terrified scream pierced through the chaos as hands reached for her, tiny fingers clawing at wood splinters as she was dragged from her hiding place. "No! Grandpa Tom!" Her voice broke on the words that had become their bond, the family connection that Marcus was now severing with professional efficiency. Thomas watched helplessly as zip-tie restraints bit into his wrists, his military training useless against the reality of age and overwhelming numbers. Marcus stepped through the ruined doorway like a general surveying conquered territory, his expensive shoes crunching over debris that represented the destruction of Thomas's last sanctuary. At 42, he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning, but his pale eyes held the hollow satisfaction of revenge finally served cold. "Katie Mitchell would be 22 today," Marcus said conversationally, adjusting his coat while his men restrained the bleeding, snarling Luna with a catchpole typically used for dangerous animals. "Old enough to have children of her own. Children who might need protection from grandfather figures with drinking problems and violent histories." Emma clutched baby Jake against her chest, both children now visible and vulnerable in ways that made Thomas's heart stop. The girl's eyes sought his across the chaos, still holding desperate trust despite witnessing his complete failure to protect them. "The beautiful irony, Thomas, is that these children will receive the protection I tried to provide Katie 15 years ago. Professional care, structured environments, families who've been thoroughly vetted and approved. Marcus knelt beside Emma, his smile carrying the practiced warmth of someone who'd perfected the art of gaining children's trust. "You'll like your new home, sweetheart. No more hiding, no more fear." Luna's struggles against the restraint pole were becoming weaker, blood from her reopened shoulder wound staining the cabin floor in expanding pools that reminded Thomas of other battles, other losses, other moments when his best efforts hadn't been enough. "Please," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible above Luna's labored breathing. "Don't take us away from Grandpa Tom. This is our family now." The child's plea hung in the air like smoke from extinguished candles, carrying the weight of every failed promise, every broken protection, every moment when love hadn't been enough to overcome evil's superior organization and resources. Marcus stood slowly, brushing imaginary dust from his coat with the same meticulous attention he applied to destroying families. Family is a legal designation, not an emotional one. These children belong to people who can provide what you cannot: stability, security, and most importantly, a future without the burden of your particular brand of guilt. Thomas felt consciousness slipping away as blood loss and despair combined into a darkness that felt familiar as an old friend. Luna's amber eyes met his one final time, carrying forgiveness he'd never earned and love he'd never deserved. The last thing he heard before everything went black was Emma's voice, strong and clear despite her tears. "You're wrong about him. Grandpa Tom isn't broken. He's just been waiting for us to come home." Consciousness returned to Thomas through waves of agony that felt familiar as old friends. The metallic taste of blood, the distant ringing that meant concussion, and the suffocating weight of failure pressing against his chest like a tombstone. But something was wrong with this particular defeat. Emma's voice drifted through the haze, not screaming in terror as he'd expected, but speaking with calm determination that belonged to someone far older than 7. "His name isn't really Marcus Volkov," she was saying to someone Thomas couldn't see. "Mama found his real papers in the office. It's Michael Brennan, and he used to work for the people who took kids away from bad families." Thomas forced his eyes open to find Emma sitting cross-legged on the cabin floor, baby Jake cradled in her lap while she addressed 2 men in FBI windbreakers who were photographing the scene with methodical precision. Luna lay beside her, heavily bandaged but alert, her amber eyes tracking every movement with protective vigilance. The revelation hit him like shrapnel. Marcus, Michael, had been the young social worker whose idealism had curdled into something monstrous after years of watching children returned to dangerous homes by overwhelmed courts. The same man who tried to save Katie from Thomas's failures had become someone who justified stealing children by convincing himself he was rescuing them. "The emergency beacon you activated led us to a storage facility in Missoula," explained Agent Sarah Chen, a compact woman whose professional demeanor couldn't entirely mask the horror in her eyes. 43 children, ages 3 to 16, being processed for international adoption fraud. "Your little Emma here provided the missing piece we needed to connect the Montana operation to trafficking networks in 6 states. Emma nodded solemnly, her small hand resting on Luna's neck as if drawing strength from the wolf dog's steady breathing. "Marcus always said we were going to families who really wanted us, but the kids who left never sent letters like he promised." The systematic nature of the operation emerged through Emma's matter-of-fact recitations. Marcus had spent 15 years building a network that exploited every weakness in America's child welfare system: forged documents, compromised officials, and legitimate-seeming charities that processed desperate families like raw materials for an international market. Thomas struggled to sit upright, his vision clearing enough to see the tactical equipment scattered around his destroyed cabin. Professional restraints, Electronic surveillance devices and medical supplies suggested an operation with resources far beyond typical criminal enterprises. He kept files on all the families, Emma continued, her voice carrying the detached tone of someone reporting facts rather than trauma. Pictures of houses, bank papers, reports about why parents weren't good enough. He had a special file about you, Grandpa Tom. Lots of pictures of the place where your family got hurt. The personal nature of Marcus's vendetta became clear through federal evidence that painted a picture of obsessive planning spanning more than a decade. He'd tracked Thomas's relocation to Montana, documented his daily routines, and waited patiently for an opportunity to demonstrate his theories about parental inadequacy. Agent Chen's partner, a graying veteran named Rodriguez, who moved with the careful gait of someone carrying invisible wounds, crouched beside Thomas with recognition in his eyes. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell, 10th Mountain Division. I read your service record. 3 tours, Purple Heart, Distinguished Service Cross. Marcus had all of it in his files." The FBI investigation had uncovered Marcus's complete psychological profile. A brilliant child advocate whose idealism had been corrupted by systemic failures and personal trauma. His own childhood in foster care had provided both motivation for protecting children and justification for removing them from families he deemed unworthy. "The tragic part," Rodriguez continued, "is that his early recommendations were usually correct. He identified real dangers, prevented actual abuse, saved kids who needed saving. But somewhere along the way, he stopped distinguishing between families that needed help and families that needed to be destroyed." Luna's recovery was nothing short of miraculous, her wolf genetics providing resilience that purely domestic dogs couldn't match. The veterinarian who'd treated her wounds expressed amazement at her pain tolerance and healing rate, but Thomas recognized something deeper. Luna was fighting to survive because she'd found purpose again in protecting children. Emma's artistic documentation of their ordeal provided federal prosecutors with evidence that would ensure Marcus faced multiple life sentences. Her drawings, created with the photographic memory that trauma sometimes burned into young minds, showed details of the trafficking operation that adult witnesses had missed or forgotten. The most devastating revelation came through Emma's final drawing, a family portrait showing herself, Jake, Thomas, and Luna arranged around a dinner table. But in the corner, barely visible in pencil sketches, stood the shadowy figures of Margaret and Katie, watching over their new family with expressions of approval rather than accusation. "She sees them too," Emma said quietly when she noticed Thomas studying the drawing. "Your other little girl and her mama, they're not angry anymore. Luna told me." Thomas looked at the wolf dog, whose amber eyes held depths that seemed to contain 15 years of shared grief and gradual healing. Luna had somehow communicated to Emma concepts that Thomas had never been able to articulate: forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility that love could transcend loss. Agent Chen's investigation revealed that Sarah Hartwell had been working undercover with federal authorities for months, gathering evidence about Marcus's operation while protecting her children from immediate harm. The tracking devices Emma had discovered were FBI surveillance equipment, not Marcus's control mechanisms. The truth struck Thomas like a physical blow. Sarah hadn't been a victim who'd stumbled into Marcus's web. She'd been a federal informant who'd volunteered to infiltrate his organization despite knowing the risks to herself and her children. Her medical emergency had been carefully orchestrated to provide cover for extracting Emma and Jake while preserving her deep cover identity. "Your daughter would be proud," Rodriguez said quietly, helping Thomas to his feet while medics checked his injuries. "You did what she couldn't. You protected children when it mattered most." Luna limped to Thomas's side, her massive head pressing against his leg with the same gentle insistence she'd shown Katie years ago. The wolf dog's forgiveness had always been absolute, But tonight it carried something new, recognition that Thomas had finally earned the trust she'd never stopped offering. Marcus's arrest outside the cabin came with the dawn, federal agents surrounding him with the same methodical precision he'd used to destroy families. His final words, shouted across the snow as handcuffs clicked into place, carried the desperate justification of someone whose worldview was crumbling. These children need structure, discipline, parents who won't fail them. Emma's response was delivered with the devastating simplicity that only children possessed. "We already have a daddy and a mama dog who takes care of us better than you ever did." The sound of helicopter rotors approaching through the mountain air signaled the end of Marcus's 15-year campaign of revenge disguised as child protection. But for Thomas, sitting in his destroyed cabin with two children who called him family and a wolf dog who'd never stopped believing in his capacity for redemption, it marked the beginning of something he'd thought impossible: a second chance at getting love right. 3 months after the arrests, Thomas Mitchell stood in his rebuilt cabin, watching Emma teach Luna how to be gentle with the Christmas ornaments they were hanging together for the first time in 16 years. The wolf dog's massive paws moved with surprising delicacy as she held tinsel in her teeth, waiting patiently for Emma's artistic direction on placement. The federal investigation had unraveled Marcus's empire with the thoroughness that only comes when criminals document their own crimes. 47 children recovered from facilities across 6 states, their stories creating a mosaic of systematic exploitation that had operated under the radar for nearly 2 decades. Marcus faced 17 federal charges, including conspiracy, fraud, and human trafficking, with prosecutors seeking multiple life sentences. Sarah Hartwell had returned from her undercover assignment fundamentally changed but unbroken, her nursing skills now directed toward helping other trafficking survivors navigate their recovery. The medical debt that had made her vulnerable to Marcus's recruitment had been eliminated through victim compensation funds, but more importantly, she'd found purpose in her survival. "The hardest part wasn't pretending to trust him," Sarah explained during one of their evening conversations around Thomas's expanded dinner table. "It was watching him manipulate other families while knowing I couldn't warn them without blowing our investigation." Emma had processed the revelation about her mother's secret FBI cooperation with the same matter-of-fact acceptance she applied to most adult complications. "Mama's a spy, like in movies," she'd announced to Luna, who'd responded with tail wagging that suggested approval of the family's dramatic upgrade. The legal formalities had been surprisingly straightforward. Thomas's emergency guardianship became permanent adoption with Sarah's blessing, creating a family structure that social workers described as unconventional but highly functional. Emma legally became Emma Mitchell, while baby Jake carried both surnames as a bridge between his birth family and chosen family. Luna's role in their recovery couldn't be overstated. The wolf dog had somehow understood that healing required routine, structure, and the kind of unconditional love that doesn't depend on human worthiness. She established morning patrols with Emma, afternoon nap supervision with Jake, and evening comfort sessions where she allowed both children to process their trauma through gentle contact with her thick fur. Thomas's own healing surprised everyone, including himself. The children's presence had forced him to confront 15 years of carefully maintained self-hatred with something stronger: the immediate necessity of being worthy of their trust. His daily routine expanded beyond mere survival to include pancakes for breakfast, bedtime stories, and Saturday morning cartoon sessions where Luna served as an oversized lapdog for giggling children. The financial transformation was equally dramatic. Federal victim compensation, combined with book advance money from publishers interested in Thomas's story, had replaced his subsistence-level existence with something approaching middle-class stability. More importantly, Emma's college fund grew monthly through donations from strangers touched by their family's journey. "You know what I learned?" Thomas said during his first interview with the trauma counselor who'd been helping all of them navigate their recovery. "I spent 15 years thinking I was being punished for Katie's death. Turns out I was being prepared to save someone else's children." Emma's artwork had evolved from documentation of trauma to celebration of survival. Her latest masterpiece, displayed prominently on the cabin's main wall, showed their family arranged around Luna in a protective circle, with ghostly figures of Margaret and Katie watching from the background with expressions of serene approval. The Christmas tree they decorated together stood in the exact spot where Thomas had once planned to die alone, its lights reflecting off windows that now framed a home rather than a hiding place. Emma had insisted on specific ornament placement: Katie's angel at the top, a photo of Margaret tucked between the branches, and handmade decorations that included Luna as a central figure in their holiday celebration. Sheriff Ray Williams stopped by most evenings, ostensibly to check on their security, but actually to witness Thomas's transformation from broken recluse to devoted grandfather. "40 years I've known you, Tommy," Ray observed, watching Emma help Thomas wrap presents while Luna supervised from her position by the fire. "Never seen you this alive, not even before the accident." The community response had been overwhelming in ways that reminded Thomas why he'd chosen Montana as his refuge. Neighbors who'd respected his isolation for 8 years now included his family in everything. Church dinners, school events, and holiday celebrations where Emma's laughter filled spaces that had been silent too long. Luna's intelligence continued to manifest in ways that defied easy explanation. The wolf dog had learned to differentiate between Jake's various cries, respond to Emma's emotional states with appropriate comfort behaviors, and alert Thomas to potential problems before they became emergencies. More remarkably, she'd begun what veterinarians described as therapeutic interaction with other trauma survivors who visited their home. Sarah's integration into their family structure had been seamless, her nursing background providing medical expertise that complemented Thomas's tactical skills and Luna's intuitive caregiving. She occupied the cabin's expanded second bedroom with Jake, while Emma had claimed the loft space that Thomas had converted from storage into a princess bedroom complete with art supplies and bookshelves. The custody hearing that finalized their family arrangements had been surprisingly emotional, with Judge Patricia Morrison acknowledging that their unconventional structure represented something beautiful emerging from shared trauma. "In 30 years on the bench, I've rarely seen a family unit that demonstrates such mutual care and protection," she'd stated while signing the adoption papers. Emma's testimony during Marcus's trial had been delivered via closed-circuit television to protect her from re-traumatization, but her words carried devastating precision that demolished his defense strategy. "He told us stories about children who got new families, but he never showed us kids who were happy, just kids who looked tired and scared in different clothes." The trial's outcome surprised no one familiar with the evidence. Marcus received 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole, his trafficking network dismantled, and its victims receiving the kind of comprehensive support that his false charity had promised, but never delivered. Luna's presence during Emma's therapy sessions had been approved after extensive evaluation, her calming influence helping the child process trauma that might otherwise have required years to overcome. The wolf dog seemed to understand when Emma needed space versus when she needed contact, providing exactly the right type of support at precisely the right moment. Thomas found himself keeping a journal again, documenting not survival strategies and guilt-driven self-recrimination, but the daily miracles of watching children heal and grow in an environment built on genuine love rather than manipulation or obligation. "Today, Emma taught Jake to clap his hands," read one entry. She's more patient with him than I ever was with Katie, probably because she understands how precious and fragile life can be. Luna watched the whole lesson with her head tilted, like she was taking notes on proper childcare techniques. The Christmas morning they'd all anticipated arrived with the kind of perfect Montana snowfall that belonged in greeting cards rather than survival stories. Emma's squeals of delight over presents filled the cabin with sounds Thomas had thought he'd never hear again, while Jake's babbling added counterpoint to Luna's contented huffing from her position beneath the tree. Sarah presented Thomas with a gift that stopped his breath, a professional portrait of their family, including Margaret and Katie rendered in soft pastels as guardian angels watching over their expanded clan. The artist had somehow captured not just their physical likenesses, but the spiritual continuity that connected past loss to present joy. "Some families are born," Emma read from the card she'd dictated to Sarah. "Others are forged in snow and sealed with wolf kisses." Thomas wiped his eyes without shame, understanding finally that tears could express joy as powerfully as they'd once expressed grief. Luna's amber gaze met his across the chaos of wrapping paper and children's laughter, her expression carrying forgiveness he'd never thought to seek, and love he'd never believed he deserved. The final gift came from Emma herself, a drawing that showed their cabin surrounded not by isolation and regret, but by roots that extended deep into Montana soil and branches that reached toward a sky filled with possibilities rather than ghosts. Outside, snow continued falling in the gentle rhythm of peace rather than the violent assault of survival, while inside their home, 3 generations of healing proved that love could indeed triumph over loss, that families could be chosen as well as born, and that sometimes the most broken people were exactly the right ones to save each other. This story reminds us that our golden years don't have to be spent counting regrets. They can be spent building new chapters. Thomas Mitchell thought his life was over after losing everything that mattered. But sometimes God places broken children in the path of broken adults, because healing happens best when we help each other. At 68, Thomas discovered that the family you choose can be stronger than the one you lost, and that love multiplied rather than divided when shared with those who need it most. Luna, the wolf dog who'd carried her own scars for 15 years, proved that loyalty doesn't diminish with age. It deepens with purpose. Emma's courage in protecting her baby brother showed that even the smallest among us can demonstrate the kind of strength that moves mountains and changes destinies. Their story teaches us that retirement doesn't mean withdrawal from life's battles. It means fighting the ones that matter most. Whether you're caring for grandchildren, volunteering with rescue animals, or simply keeping your heart open to unexpected connections, remember that your experience, your wisdom, and your capacity for love are exactly what someone else needs to survive their darkest hour. Have you ever found unexpected family later in life? Or has an animal companion provided comfort during difficult times? What small act of kindness do you wish someone had shown you during your hardest season? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Your story might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear today.